don't use it, you lose it.
Baruch Hashem, you have children in Einiglich, and I'm sure they'll be happy to help you set it up.
Oh, yes. I just have to get time for them to come over.
Yep.
Oh, there I am.
Okay. I'm going to share the daf, and then we'll be able to all see the same thing.
You're on mute.
Okay, geweldig. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so let's get started. We're right at the top of daf Tezain Amud Aleph. Okay, gewaltig. Zog the Heilige Gemara. Kol shaloi nasis b'cholei. The Mishnah says, in order to add on to the Azorah or to add on to Yerushalayim, you need a whole bunch of pieces to the process. You need the Melech, the Kohen Gadol, the Sanhedrin, the Urim V'Tumim, the Chaloi Satoida, and there's one more thing that you need. Let me see if I could remember. I don't remember what the other thing was. There were 6 items. Again, I'll try again. Sanhedrin, Ayin Aleph, the Kohen Gadol, the Melech, the Toida, you need the Urim V'Tumim, and you need the shear. You need shear. So Zakta Gemara Kol Shalai Nasis B'Chol Elu, it won't work. Itmar Rav Huna Amar. Rav Huna said B'Chol Elu is exactly as what the Mishnah says. B'Chol Elu. All of these 6 components are necessary. However, Rav Nachman says Ba'achas Mikol Elu. It doesn't mean you need every one of these. One of them alone would be enough. Tanan. I'm sorry, Mikol Elu Tanan. It says Achas Mikol Elu. Now we're going to get to the reasoning behind the machlokes. Rav Huna Amar B'Chol Elu Tanan. You need all of these items, and without that, you can't be Mekadosh. But that poses a problem, because how was Ezra able to be Mekadosh once again? Yerushalayim, when he came back after Golos Bavel, they were missing some of the items. As Rashi says on the 4th line, Rashi says, in the Bayis Sheni, there was no Melech, and there was no Urim V'Tumim. And those are 2 of the ingredients that are necessary to be Mekadosh. So how was it that there was Kedusha by the second Beis HaMikdash? So Zog to Gemara, Rav Nachman holds, Kasavar, Rav Huna holds, even though we didn't have what we would need to how did the second Beis HaMikdash have Kedusha, because Rav Huna holds, Kedusha Rishayna Kitcha L'Shaita, Ve Kitcha L'Asad Lava. In fact, even though Klarsha went to Golos, the original Kedusha that was upon Yerushalayim, upon the Beis HaMikdash, remained. So therefore, even though Ezra didn't have the tools to re-sanctify the Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash, it wasn't necessary. It never lost its Kedusha. Didn't we learn in the Pasuk that Ezra made a whole process with the Chalei Stoida? What was that about? So the Gemara of Ezra, Zecher Ba'al Mahuda Avad. He made a ceremony, but it didn't really do anything. The Kedusha was there, but I guess when they came back, he made a ceremony. But it had no impact whatsoever. That is the Chita of Rav Huna. Rav Nachman Amar, Ba'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. Our Mishnah is not saying that you need to have all of those components. One of these components is enough. Therefore, he can hold Kasavar Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel Shaita, like Kitchel Asalavai. Even if you learn that the Kedusha of the first Beis HaMikdash was dissolved when the Beis HaMikdash was Charav and the Eden went into Galus, Ezra could have come back and re-sanctify them. The Ezra Kedusha Kodesh, Apple Gabla have the Urim V'Tumim, but Rav Nachman learns Achas Mikol Elu is enough. So let's get that clear. There's a machlokes whether or not Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel L'Shaita or not. If you hold it was not Kitchel L'Shaita, then Ezra would have needed to reestablish it. if he needed to reestablish it, it must be that you don't need all the 6 ingredients because he didn't have them. So only one of them would be enough, which is the Shita of Rav Nachman. Rav Huna holds you need all the ingredients, and in fact, Ezra could not have re-sanctified Yerushalayim, and he didn't because the Kedusha from the first Beis Hamikdash remained, and he was just doing a ceremony. So that is the machlokes that we have. Frank the Gemara Esvei. Esvei Rava Rav Nachman. Rava Atakash Rav Nachman. So remember, Rav Nachman is the Mandamar who holds Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Shaita, V'loyla Asad Lavai. And therefore Ezra had to re-sanctify, but he was able to because you only need one of the ingredients. The problem is, our Mishnah says, Kol Shaloi Nasis B'chol Elu. So what's Rav Nachman going to do with the words of the Mishnah? B'chol Elu. Dr. Mar, he'll change the word. Tani B'achas B'chol Elu. He'll learn that what it says is B'achas B'chol Elu. Tashma, the Gemara brings another ayah. Abba Shol the Tana said, Shnei bitzin hayu b'har mishcha. Har mishcha is har hazeisim. On har hazeisim, naturally, the further down the mountain you are, the closer you are to the city of Yerushalayim. At the top of the mountain, you're further away from Yerushalayim. So Zog B'Shol, Shnei bitzin hayu b'har mishcha. There were two marshes or swamps, marshes on har mishcha on har hazeisim. I don't think there's any zecher left of them because when you look at har hazeisim now, it's just dry sand. But in those days, at the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, there were two marshes there. Bahar Mishcha. There is a Tachtoina of Elyoina. The Tachtoina, which was closer to Yerushalayim, and the Elyoina was further away from Yerushalayim. Tachtoina, the one at the bottom of the mountain that was closer to Yerushalayim, Niskachu b'cholei. They actually expanded Yerushalayim in the days of the first Beis Hamikdash when they had all of the necessary components to do so, and they built a wall. So basically, they had one wall that was around Yerushalayim. Then they made another wall that included the bits in Tachtoina, the lower part of Har HaZeisim. And then by the second Beis Hamikdash, and then Al Yoina, Lo Niskacha B'Chalelu, Ela B'Oilei Goyla. The El Yoina, the upper portion of Har HaZeisim, there was also a wall around it. But it wasn't really part of Yerushalayim. They put a wall around it, but it wasn't really part of Yerushalayim because they didn't be Mekadosh by the first Beis Hamikdash. It was only the Oila Goyla for the second Beis Hamikdash who came, and Shaloi b'Melech v'Shaloi b'Urim v'Tumim. They didn't have the Melech, they didn't have the Urim v'Tumim, so therefore they weren't able to. So basically, what we're saying is that you need the Melech, and you need the Urim v'Tumim, and you need everything. It's B'cholelu, which supports Rav Huna, which is Akasha on Rav Nachman. Now we have a very interesting scenario. So let's just get clear what our zones is. In the actual walls of Yerushalayim, that's for sure, Yerushalayim proper. In the wall that includes the lower part of Har HaZeisim, that's also Yerushalayim proper, now that it was expanded with all of the requirements. And then the third wall, which is further up the mountain, although there's a wall there, but in that perimeter, you are not technically in Yerushalayim. And because of that, Zok the Gemara, because of that, Tachtoina Shahaisa Kedushasa Gemura, the lower wall in Har HaZeisim, where everybody agrees that was made during the first Beis Hamikdash. So all that area on the lower half of the mountain is part of Yerushalayim proper with all the Kedusha. Amei ha'aretz nechnasin l'sham v'oichlin sham kachim kalam. Amei ha'aretz would eat kachim kalam there. It's Yerushalayim. And you know that you're only allowed to eat kachim kalam within the boundaries of Yerushalayim. So they would eat kachim there, no problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But avaloi ma'asher sheni. They wouldn't eat ma'asher sheni there. For ma'asher sheni, they wanted to come into the original wall of Yerushalayim, which is strange. Halachically, they're both Yerushalayim. But the Chaverim, the Talmidei Chachamim, Oichlin Sham Kodeshim Kalim, U'Ma'asher Sheni, because technically that wall that's on the lower half, that includes the lower half of Har HaZeisim, is very much halachically part of Eretz Yisrael. Yet the Amaratzim, they didn't want to eat their Ma'asher Sheni, and we're going to soon see why. El Yoina, the upper wall, which really is not part of Yerushalayim halachically, Shaloi Haisa Kedushasa Gemura. So it's not Yerushalayim. Technically, you cannot eat Ma'asher Sheni there, and you can't eat kachim there. Nevertheless, Amei Haaretz hayu nechnosin sham va'oichlin sham kachim kalam. They wrongfully ate kachim kalam out of the boundaries of Yerushalayim. Avaloi ma'ashasheni, but they wouldn't eat ma'ashasheni. That they still ate in the original wall. So we're going to have to understand these Amaratzim. They seem to be very far from when it comes to ma'ashasheni, but not at all concerned when it comes to kachim. What's the reason for that? The Chaverim, the Talmid Chachamim, Ein Oichlin sham would not eat in the outer wall. Loy kachim kalam v'loy ma'ashasheni, because it was not part of Yerushalayim. So let's stop for a minute and try to understand why the Amaratzim would be so makbid of Ma'aser Sheni and only eat it in the inner wall, the innermost wall in the Yerushalayim proper, yet when it came to Kachim, they were willing even to eat it in what halachically was not Yerushalayim. So let's look at Rashi. I'm looking at Rashi right in the middle of the Amud, right opposite Laze Rashi, where Rashi quotes the whole Gemara, and then he says, V'yesh lefarish. Let's explain what's happening over here. The Amei Haaretz Hamafrishin Maishris. Now we know there's something called the Mai, because although Roiv Amei Haaretz separate Meiser, Amiyah don't. So we're talking about the Roiv. The Roiv Amaratim that are Mafresh to Maishris, they weren't stam Mafresh to Maishris. They were very makbid to do it in the best possible way, Lala. Hayuzrizim lasos by mitzvah min amufar. Why were they so eager to do the mitzvah of Ma'aser Sheni, mitzvah min amufar? Because they used to hear the Rav's drush in shul. And you know what the Rav's drush in shul was? They believed, which it is true, that Meiser makes you wealthy. And they wanted to make sure to do this Meiser job perfectly because they wanted to benefit from the wealth that they would get from the Meiser. They had to, every couple of years, you have to do Vidu Meisers. And when they said Vidu Meisers, what did they say? They said, I did the mitzvah of Meisers to perfection. And they would hear the Metargimim who would say over the Rav's drasha and explain it in greater detail so that they could understand it better. And this is what the Metargim would say. You have to eat it in front of Hashem. Therefore, they didn't want to take any chances going into the area that was added on during the first base of Mikdash. We want to be mamish lefnei Hashem alekecha because we want to do the meiser perfectly, so we'll be zoicha to our shirs. The kachim didn't concern them. There's no money in it for them. They wouldn't even come into Yerushalayim. They'd go into the outer perimeter. If they couldn't get a good deal on the hotel in Yerushalayim proper, they would stay on the outskirts, within the third wall. And when the Rabbanim would tell them, how could you eat kachim in the upper half of Har HaZeisim, Zu Kedusha, in the second wall, it's Kadosh. But in the third wall, on the top half of Har HaZeisim, it's not Yerushalayim, it's also Tikachim there. They didn't listen to the Rabbanim. You know why? Because they said, what do you want? This is, I'm in the wall. They couldn't understand what's the big deal. I'm in the wall. I'm in Yerushalayim. They didn't realize it's not just being in the wall. You have to be in the makom that has Kedusha Yerushalayim. So Lagabi Kachim, they didn't care because it didn't mean anything to them. But Ma'aser, they wanted to make sure to do the job right. While the Chaverim, the Talmid Chacham, said no. You're Yosy Ma'aser and all the exclusive of Asher's Kedusha Asher, even if you're in Halachat Yerushalayim, which includes the lower half of Har HaZeisim, and the kachim could be eaten there. But Chas v'Shalom, kachim may not be eaten out of Yerushalayim at the top half of Har HaZeisim.
Why did they see that the Amaratzim were getting rich?
The Amaratzim were getting rich.
Yeah, they were getting rich.
They got rich, that's true. But they still were not eating kachim in the right place.
They got
it worked. Yeah, they got their objective. They fulfilled their objective. But you know what? The Chaverim also got rich because they also ate it in Yerushalayim. But I guess they wanted to make sure to be Mekayim that mitzvah of Meiser with all the pitchakis.
There's that Machsidim, Zatiyan.
Yeah. Kabbalah always says, Everybody's always looking for a school for parnasa. You want a school for parnasa? Bench like a mensch and daven like a mensch. That's the best school. Where the Sabbath Rebbe says all these schools are great until 9 a.m. From 9 a.m. and on, the best school for parnasa is to get a job. Okay, gewaltig. So Zog to Gemara weiter. So what we extract from here is that it's quite clear that the Tan Abba Shol says Kedusha Rishona. I'm sorry. It's clear that Abba Shol says that you cannot add anything on to Yerushalayim unless you have all the pitchakis. That is consistent with what Rav Huna said that you need b'chalei, but it's against Rab Nachman because Rab Nachman says you only need one of the things. So that's the kasha that we have. But let's continue on this brisa. V'lama kitshua. The Mishnah, the brisa asks, so why were they mekadesh that part on the upper half of Har HaZeisim? So the Gemara interjects, Lama kitshua. What do you mean? Why were they mekadesh? Ha'amrit loy kitshua. You just said a moment ago that they weren't mekadesh that upper part because they weren't able to. Ella, the question really is Lama hechnisua. Why did they even put a wall around it and sort of annex it to part of Yerushalayim? It's not Yerushalayim. Why would they even do anything like that? The Teretism, the Shetar Yerushalayim. It's a mountain opposite Yerushalayim. Controlling that area will protect you from people who want to come attack. If they didn't control that area and the enemy would be there, it would be very easy. It would be easy for an enemy to conquer Yerushalayim if they occupied that high ground on Har HaZeisim. That's why they walled it in. But Avada didn't have Kedusha to it. So now, I'm sorry? So now we have a kasha. Here, Rab Nachman said you only have to have one ingredient. Yet clearly, Abba Shol says you need all the ingredients. And for the Gemara, Tanoi, this shaila between Rab Nachman and Rav Huna is in fact a machlokes Tanoim. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Rabbi Eliezer said, Shemaiti, I heard, when they were building the second base of Mikdash, they while they were building the wall, they wanted to create the perimeter, so they put up curtains around the perimeter of the walls of the Heichal. They also put up curtains around the perimeter of the walls of the Azara until they actually built the stone walls. So Rabbi Eliezer said, I heard, also koloim laheichal. They made curtains around the footprint of the Heichal, and they made koloim lazaris, and they also put curtains around the perimeter of the Azara. Right. But there was a difference between the positioning of these curtains. In the Heichal, let's say the footprint of the wall is, let's say, 6 feet thick. It was even bigger than that. Let's say the footprint was 6 feet thick. Where do they put the curtain? On the inside perimeter or on the outside perimeter? Zok Rabbi Eliezer, they put the curtain on the inside perimeter. So when they were working on the wall, they were standing outside the Heichal, and they were building the wall from the outside. They would build the walls of the Heichal while they were not standing in the Heichal, while they're standing out of the Heichal. And they wouldn't even be able to see inside the Heichal because there's curtains that are blocking. Uvazarais, but then when you're building the Azarais, they're boinin mibifnim. There the curtain went around the outer perimeter of the wall, and they were standing inside the Azara as they were building the wall. Now Rashi says, at this point, the Gemara thinks, why would they do it that way? It must be that they wanted to bring karbanos even before the base of Mikdash was rebuilt, and you can't bring karbanos when there's no building. You have to have a bias. So they use the curtains to create as a temporary bias so that they can bring karbanos, which would indicate that Kedusha Rishona like Kitchelas and Lavai. If you hold Kedusha Rishona, Kitchelas and Lavai, there's Kedusha in that place whether or not there's anything there. But if you hold, you need to have the walls there, it means you have to rebuild the base of Mikdash in order to have the Kedusha. So clearly, Rabbi Eliezer seems to indicate that he holds Kedusha Rishona, Kitcha.
How many squares?
The
servings has 40 bread. The serving size, it says the total is 40.
Zok to Gemara. That's what Rabbi Eliezer seems to hold. Now, Rabbi Yeshua seems to make a comment that has nothing to do with Rabbi Eliezer, but the Gemara is going to understand it as a machlokes. Rabbi Shua, Shemait Ishe Makrivin, Afal Pishein bias. You could be makar kabbanis even if there's no bias. Because Kedusha Rishonah is Kitchalos and Lavai as well. So even though there's no base of Mikdash now, but the Kedusha from the first base of Mikdash is still there. Oichlin Kache Kachim, Afal Pishein Kloim. You can eat Kache Kachim, even though you're only allowed to eat it within the Azar. You can eat it in the Makam of the Azar, even though there's no Azar now. There's no walls. And Kachim Kalam and Ma'aser Sheni, which you're allowed to eat in all of Yerushalayim, you're allowed to eat in the whole Shedach of Yerushalayim, Afal Pishein Chayma, so Zokt Gemara Lab Mechlal, the Rabbi Eliezer Sober, Loi Kitchalos and Lavai. Wouldn't it seem to be mashma from Yeshua's comments that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he holds that Loi Kitchalos and Lavai. So once we demonstrate such a machlokes, we know that Rabbi Eliezer is going to have to hold, like Rabbi Nachman, that one component alone would be enough to add kedusha. Zokt Gemara, you do not have a right. Zokt Gemara, Amalei Ravina Ravashi Mimai. Who said that's how you should understand Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua that they're arguing? Dilma dechula alma kedusha rishono kitchel shaita v'kitchel asadavai. Maybe everybody holds kitchel shaita v'kitchel asadavai. Umar madishmir lekamar. Umar madishmir lekamar. And Rabbi Eliezer was just saying over what he heard, and Rabbi Yeshua was saying over what he heard, but they weren't necessarily arguing. If you're going to say that Rabbi Eliezer agrees that kitchel shaita v'kitchel asadavai, so what's the reason for making these curtains? Zok Gemara v'chitema kloim l'Rabbi Eliezer lo mali. Zok Gemara, let's use Obama. Simple. You're in Beis Hamikdash. It should be tzniustic. There should be partitions up. Ella Hani Tanoi. Oh, I forgot to mention something very important. In the Havamina of Rabbi Eliezer, what did Rabbi Eliezer say? The even in the Maskana, what did he say? The perimeter curtains were on the inside of the surface of the wall for the Hechel, but on the outside of the surface of the wall for the Azor. Why is that? So Rashi explains, you're not allowed to have anah. It's not appropriate to have anah from the inside of the Hechel. So therefore, they built it from the outside in. They couldn't even see in because there was a curtain around it. And this way, while they were building it, they weren't being nehenna from looking at the beautiful interior of the Hechel. On the other hand, the Azara, there is no problem looking at the Azara. It's made for the public, and therefore they were able to work on it from the inside. Okay, gewaltig. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Elahane Tanoi. We're looking for support to Rab Nachman to find a Tana that holds Kedusha Rishoyna Kitcha L'Shaita and Kitcha L'Asad Lavai. I'm sorry, and Loi Kitcha L'Asad Lavai, and therefore Ezra needed to be re-mekadesh, to re-sanctify the city, and therefore you have to hold that one of the components is enough. You don't need all six. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Omar Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy. Lama manu chachamim es elu. The Mishnah in Erechin talks about the halachas of Botei Arechin. The halacha is, if you have a house in a walled city and you sell it, you have 1 year to buy it back. And if you don't buy it back within 1 year, it remains a permanent sale to the buyer. And this only applies to walled cities that have walls mimosh Yeshua benun. And the Mishnah there lists off a series of cities that fall into this category. But the problem is there were many, many more. So Zok to Gemara as follows: Ramini, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy. What do you think? There were only those limited cities that the Mishnah lists off? There were so many more cities that qualify as Mukavas Chayma in Moshe Yeshua benun. Like for Nemar Shishim Ir, Kol Chelab Argev, Mamlechas Oig Baboshan, Kol Ela Orim Betzuros Chayma Gavoya. We had 60 cities that were walled cities. So why does the Mishnah only list off a few? So why did the Chum pick just, I think, 6 cities to list when there were 60? The teretz is when the Eden came up after Golos Bavel, Matzu Elu, they found these cities, the Kitchum, and they were Mekadesh them. Franklin or Kitchum, they were Mekadesh them. They couldn't have been Mekadesh them. Hashta ha'amrina l'kaman We're going to shortly learn. The Brisa continues, and he's going to tell us that they didn't have to be Mekadesh those cities. So what does it mean, Matu Elu V'Kitchum? Ella, what happened is Matu Elu Umanu. They weren't Mekadesh any cities at all. But when they were coming back up from the Golos, they happened to have bumped into these 6 cities. There were many more, but in their route up to Yerushalayim, they bumped into these 6 cities. And that's why those are the 6 cities that the Mishnah lists. But you should know, as a fact, it's not only these 6 cities that have the halachas of Batei Arei Chayma, rather, elakol shetala b'yotcha mesayris me'avoisecha shenukefes chayma mimoy sheshua b'nu. Any other city that you can identify that it had its wall since the times of Yeshua ben Nun, kol mitzvahs elu noheges ba. All of the mitzvahs that we're saying apply exclusively to Arei Chayma will apply to any city, whether it's on our limited list or not, any city that you can verify that was Mukavas Chayma Mimoshe Shubanu. Why is that? Nobody re-sanctified them. So it says Beferish over here, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy says, Kitchel Rishayna was Kitchel Lashaita and Lasalavai. But we have another Brisa from the same Tana that says the opposite. Kasha de Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy, ad Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy. So it's a stira in the halacha of Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy. Why? Because the first Brisa we quoted from Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy said, Alva Rishonos Batlu Misha Batla Aretz. Right? The first Brisa, I'm not sure if I skipped. I think I skipped. Let me start again. Hani Tanoi, the Tanya Amar Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosy. Lama Manu Chachamim Es Elu. Why did the Chacham list after these 6? Shekish Olu B'nei Agoyla Matu Elu V'Kitchum. I will Rishonos Batlu Misha Batla Aretz. The reason why I only listed these 6 cities and not all 60 is because all the other cities, since they didn't re-sanctify them, they lost their Kedusha. So from this Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy, Alma Kosavar Kedusha Rishayna was Kitchel Hashaita v'lai Kitchel Hasalav. This Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy clearly says that it was like Kitchel Hasalav, which is how we're learning in Rabbi Nachman. But there were many. We have a stira because we have another brisa from Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy who asks the same question with a different conclusion. Aram B'tzur Eschaima Gavaya. Zok to Gemara Ella Zok Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy. What happened? Elalama Manu Chachamim Es Elu Shekishalu B'nei Agala Matu Elu B'Kitchum. Fragmar Kitchum Hashtar Minul Kaman. We're going to say in a moment the Lord Shrichel of Tushay because they retained their Kedusha. Ella, what it means is Matu Elu Umanum. They found these and they counted them. But they said V'lo Elu B'Vad Elu Kol Shetal B'Yot From Asaris Ma'Vesecha Shemu Kefes Chaimim Moshe Umanon Kol Mitzvahs Elu Nagispa. If they should Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel Lashaita V'Kitchel Lasadlov. So you see, we have 2 different Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosys. One who learns that only those 6 cities are still relevant to Batei Arei Chayma because only those were re-sanctified, because the original Kedusha is not there anymore. And then you have another Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel and Puk Fakir that all the cities still count because the original Kedusha stays on them. So we have a machlokes over here between Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy. It's a stira. Dr. Mori, Ibari is saying about Trey Tenoya, Libid Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy. Could be it's a machlokes tonight what Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy actually said. That's one shot. And Ibari is saying about Chadabi Nayu is Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Yosy. One of these 2 tonight is not Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy, it's Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Yosy, because we know that he said Kedusha Rishayna, it's Kishal Lasalove as well. The Tanya Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Yosy Aimer, it says Asher Loi Chayim. If you look at the pasuk, which we have here at the side of the daf, it says in the pasuk as follows: V'im lo yigal ad meloi sloi shana tamima. If you sell your house in this walled city and you don't redeem it for a full year, the kama bayis asher bo'ir, the house that's in this city asher loy chayma that has a wall, litzmisos, it's forever l'koynois. Now this loy in this little pasuk of Torah Shalom is just lamed vav, but if you look it up, it says lamed vav aleph, so it's loy with an aleph. So Zok Rebbe Lazar, why does it have that loy with an aleph? Asher loy chayma with an aleph, to tell you it doesn't need to have a wall now. It's Kedusha Rishayna, Kitchel, Shaita, Ula, Asad, Lavoi. If it once had a wall, that Kedusha remains forever, and it's always going to be considered a walled city. So at the end of the day, we have proven a Machlokes Tanoim about Kedusha Rishayna, Kitchel, Shaita, or it's Kitchel, Asad, Lavoi as well. And therefore, although Rav Huna holds Kitchel, Asad, Lavoi, Rav Nachman has strong support with Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosy, who says Kitchel Shaita v'lo Kitchel Asad Lavoi, and therefore Ezra had to re-sanctify Yerushalayim, but only one of the ingredients listed in our Mishnah is adequate to re-sanctify Yerushalayim. Gewaltig. So now let's turn on to Amud Beis to be mamshech the daf. Zok to Gemara, Nitma Bazara Benelma Mimenu Tuma. Now, in the first parak, the Mishnah lists off two variations of Tumash Mikdash V'Kadosh. Either somebody forgot that he was Tameh and he walked into the Beis HaMikdash, or somebody forgot that he was Tameh and ate kosher. Our Mishnah here at the beginning of the second parak introduces a third option, and that is one was already standing in the Azara, and someone became Tameh while he was standing in the Azara, and he didn't go out because he was shogig, he didn't know that he was Tameh, so that also brings a carbon oil of right? And if he bemazed didn't go out, then he'll be chayav carbs. So Frank the Gemara, Tuma Bazar Minola. We know the pasuk says you're not allowed to come into the Beis HaMikdash when you're Tameh. It says Lo Yitamu Es Machaneya. That's the law where the Torah says you're not allowed to come in to the Beis HaMikdash when you're Tameh. But where does it say anywhere that if you become Tameh in the Beis HaMikdash you have to run out? It doesn't say that. So how do you know that there's chiyuvim for that as well, just like a chiyuv for coming in? So Omar Belazar, Kasav Echad Oimer, one pasuk says, Es Mishkan Hashem Timei, when it talks about the chiyuv kares for coming into the Beis HaMikdash when you're Tameh, and another pasuk expresses it, because of Echad Oimer, Ki Es Mikdash Hashem Timei. Now, why do we need two psukim to tell us the same thing? That if you come in to the Beis HaMikdash, when you're Tameh, you're chayav kares. Why do we need two psukim for that? I'm going to read the brackets. In Me'ena Yinin Otuma Shabachutz, Vibalt had only two psukim to tell us that you're not allowed to walk into the Beis HaMikdash when you're Tameh. Teneu Yinin Otuma Shabifnim. Let's say one of the psukim is coming to tell us that if you became Tameh inside, you have to leave right away. Frank the Gemara, you could only make this drasha because you're assuming that one of these two psukim are extra. But we're going to challenge that. They're not extra. Ukroi miyasrei. Are you telling me that one of these psukim are extra? Hamitrich trichi. We need these two psukim to teach us another important limud. The Tanya we learned, Rabbi Lazar says, Im nemar mishkan, if one pasuk says mishkan, why do we need another pasuk to say mikdash? Lama nemar mikdash. Im nemar mikdash, lama nemar mishkan. They're both the same thing. We already know. Why is there two psukim? Zok the Gemara, Zok the Tanya Rabbi Lazar as follows. Ilu nemar mishkan, v'lo nemar mikdash. If we only said mishkan and not mikdash, hayisi omer, you know what I would have said? Al mishkan yechayiv. All of the chiyuvim of tumash mikdash v'kadoshav only applies in the mishkan, but not in the Beis HaMikdash. Why should it apply in the mishkan, not in the Beis HaMikdash? Because the kedusha of the mishkan is stronger than the kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash. How do you see that? Cherei mashuach b'shem in mishkan. Because the mishkan had a special kedusha because it was niskadish by being smeared with the Shem Mishkan, which he didn't do in the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, maybe Val Mikdash lo yechai. Maybe the whole parsha of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav only applies to the Mishkan and not to the Beis HaMikdash. That's why it had to say Mikdash. But why did it have to say Mishkan? Because if never Mishkan, Mikdash, well, never Mishkan, then you say Mefaker. Al Mikdash yechai. You're only chayiv for coming into the Beis HaMikdash when you're Tamei, because its kedusha is stronger, because it's a permanent kedusha. Sharei kedusha zay kedusha zayla. But Val Mishkan lo yechayev. You're not chayev for the Mishkan because the Mishkan was a temporary. Maybe it's only temporary. It doesn't have the same chiyuvim of Tumah. Lekach nemer mishkan, lekach nemer mikdash. That's what it says both, so you should make no mistake. The halacha, the prohibition of going into the Beis Hamikdash when you're tamei, applies equally to going into the Mishkan and going in to the Beis Hamikdash. So I just want to pause for one moment because the Gemara says right over here, the Brisa that we're quoting from Belazar says right over here that the Beis Hamikdash is Kedusha Soilo. Isn't that a raya right here, right now, that Kedusha Rishon and Kitcha Los Lavai? Zok says, no, you don't have a raya. Because maybe what Kedusha Soilo means, not that the Kedusha never stops, but it means it's permanent, which means if there's going to be a second Beis Hamikdash eventually, and a third Beis Hamikdash, it's always going to be on that same place. But the Mishkan was mobile. There wasn't no permanent Kedusha in any specific place. I'll call upon him. We need Mishkan and Mikdash to tell us that the Isurim apply to Mishkan and to Mikdash. So we don't have anything extra to teach us that there's also a chiyuv if one does not enter the Beis Hamikdash, but rather he's already there and becomes tamei while he's there. Zok Gemara Rabbi Lazar still has an extra that we can use to teach us this halacha that if one is in the Beis Hamikdash and they're tamei, there's also a chiyuv. And I'm going to go into the Bach because the Bach adds a lot to the Gemara. So I'm going to look at the Aleph in the Bach. So I'm going to scroll up to where the Bach is. Let me see if I can find the Bach. Oh, I have to scroll down. So I'm here at the bottom of the Amud. I have my Bach over here. I'm not sure where you have the Bach on your Amud, but it says as follows. Michti, Mishkan Ikri Mikdash, Mikdash Ikri Mishkan. We're going to show you soon with Psukim that the word Mishkan could refer both to the Mishkan and to the Beis HaMikdash. The word Mikdash can also refer both to the Mishkan and to the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, Trey Kroy Lomeli, we still have an extra pasuk because Mishkan means both, and Mikdash means both. So I wouldn't have to worry about thinking that maybe it doesn't apply to the Mishkan or it doesn't apply to the Mikdash because either word, Mishkan or Mikdash, applies to both. So Trey Kroy Lomeli. Reading weiter in the Bach, and that's how we know Sai that the Isurim apply equally to a Mishkan and a Mikdash, and Sai that the Isurim apply even if the person only became Tameh while he was in the Beis HaMikdash. Gewaltig. Zok Gemara Bishlama. Bishlama Mikdash Ikri Mishkan. That you're telling me that the Beis HaMikdash can also be referred to with the name Mishkan is because we have a pasuk. The pasuk says after the Mishkan was already built, the pasuk says as follows. It says V'nesati Mishkani b'soichachem v'loisigal nafshi eskem. That's in Vayikra, after the Mishkan was built. After the Mishkan was built, the Torah is telling us that sometime in the future, I will put my Mishkan amongst you. Clearly, that's referring to the Beis HaMikdash. So you see that the Mishkan refers to the Beis HaMikdash. El Mishkan Dikri Mikdash, but where do you find that the Torah refers to the Mishkan using the word Mikdash? Minala. Ilema, if it's from the following pasuk. Midichsev Nasu HaKahatim. The family of Kahas were Noisei Mikdash, they carried the Mikdash referring to the Mishkan. That's not a raya. Because Ahuba Aron, that's not referring to the whole Mishkan, that's referring to the Aron. So you still don't find a pasuk that refers to the entire Mishkan as a Mikdash. Elamehacha is from the following pasuk. It says, also li Mikdash v'shachanti b'soicha. At the beginning of Parshas Truma, it says, make for me a Mikdash, and I will live amongst you. And then it says, v'chsiv k'chal asher animar aitzches tavas ha-Mishkan. So you see clearly that the word Mikdash can also be used to describe the Mishkan. Beautiful. Now let's continue on to the next halacha of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says if somebody was in the Azara and he became Tameh suddenly, and he didn't go straight out, he delayed. Either he actually bowed down in the Beis HaMikdash, or he didn't bow down, but he waited the amount of time that it takes to bow down. Well, let's say a full bow with all its pitchivkis takes 5 seconds, just for argument's sake. Let's see the Gemara. Amarava loishanu ela sheishtacha veklape pnim. Now, it says in the Mishnah, you either bowed or you waited enough to bow. It's a mashma that the bowing would take less time than the Shah Kadesh Takava. So Zok Rava, you know when we say you don't need the full 5 seconds? That's if you bowed towards the Beis HaMikdash itself, towards the Ma'ariv. Now, how can you bow down if it takes longer to bow? The Torah says a normal, proper bow takes, let's say, 5 seconds. But you can do a quick bow in 2 seconds. So Zok Gemara, Zok Rava, you know when the Mishnah says that bowing, even though it's not as long as a full bow, is enough to be mechayiv somebody for remaining in the Beis HaMikdash when he was tamei, that's if he was bowing towards the heichal. But if he was bowing in the other direction, then that's not called a real bow, and therefore he has to be there the amount of a full bow, full 5 seconds. Sha'in loy sha'loy. And there's 2 reasons for this. Rashi says, if you bow klapei pnim, that's a bow. That's a proper bow. Bowing in the opposite direction, that's not called bowing. So therefore, all it is time. The time has to be the full 5 seconds. But if you're actually bowing, and that only works if you're bowing towards the Beis HaMikdash, then even a mini bow would be enough to be mechayiv something. The Rimigash has another interesting point. He says, if you're bowing on your way out, you're on your way out. So you're going straight out. If you go straight out, you're not chayiv. So a small bow along the way doesn't mean anything. Unless you pause full 5 seconds to bow along the way. Bashenkin, if you're bowing towards the inside, you're going in the wrong direction. So therefore, even a small bow will be mechayiv you because you're clearly delaying. You're going in the wrong way. You're facing the wrong direction. It takes time to turn around. So that's what the Rava said, and that was the first shot. But Ika de Masila Seifa, there are those who quote Rava's comment on the Seifa, the Mishnah, on the next halach. Oisha Shah B'chtei Ishtachava. So it's not going on Aval Ishtachava. It's saying it's going on the second half of Oisha Shah B'chtei Ishtachava. Now, Mechalal Ishtachava Gufa Boishia. Since the Mishnah says you waited there the amount of time that it takes to bow, it must be that bowing also has a minimum timing. On that, Rava said, when does the bowing have a full time requirement? That is if you're bowing towards the outside. If you're bowing towards the inside, even though you didn't wait the full 5 seconds, it only took 2 seconds, there will still be a chiyuv. And this is what the Mishnah means to say. If you bow towards the Beis HaMikdash, which took 2 seconds, or he bowed the other way, but he took the amount of time for a full ishtachava, he took the full 5 seconds, chayiv, he will be chayiv. Okay, perfect. Now the Gemara wants to know what exactly is a full bow, what's a half bow, what are these things? They're theoretical until we actually make them practical. We know exactly what the exact timings are. So, frankly, the ishba she'iyah, what's called a ishtachava that takes the full amount of time? The lesba she'iyah, and what's a mini bow? The lesba she'iyah zu kriya ba'alma. That's bending down on your knees. Just bending on your knees takes a moment. That's the mini ishtachava. The isbe she'iyah, a full-blown bow, you know what that is? That's pishut yodayim v'raglayim. That's literally lying flat on your face and stretching out your arms and legs. That takes more than just bending to your knees. Frankly, more, okay, you gave me examples of these 2 activities, but Lamaisa, how long does this activity take? How long does it take to do pishut yodayim v'raglayim? The chameshir shia, Zakmar pligiva Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani v'chade imei. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani and his friend argue. Who is his friend? Umanu Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Well, there are those who learn it's the opposite. It's Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi v'chade imei. It's Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi and one of his friends. Umani Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani. There are those who say that the friend was Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. So what's the machlokes? Chad Omar kememre dai psuka. One says that the amount of time that it takes to do a full bow is the amount of time it takes to read this entire pasuk that we're going to quote shortly. Only half of the pasuk, the time that it takes to read half of the pasuk, starting from the word vayichru in the pasuk. What is the pasuk? It says v'chol b'nei Yisrael royim beredes haish. Everyone saw when the fire came down to the mizbeach. The cover Hashem al abayis, and the cover of Hashem was on the house. Vayichru, that's the Vayichru. Vayichru apayim arza. They bowed down twice to the ground. Ala ritzba, on the floor. Vayishtachavu. V'haydos Hashem. Ki toiv ki lodim chasdei. So either it's the amount of time it takes to read the entire pasuk, or the amount of time it takes to read from Vayichru till then. Taner Rabbanan. Kida. There's Kida, there's Hishtachavoya, and there's Kriya. So the Gemara wants to describe what these three types of bowings are. So Kida is alapayim. It means you're standing on your feet and you're able to bend all the way down and bring your face to the ground. I can't even touch my knees, never mind my toes. Here we're talking about someone who can bring his head to the ground. It's a very difficult activity. The Gemara tells us that Yeshua ben Levi once got injured while attempting a Kida. Where do you see that that's what a Kida means? Vasheva bowed down to her husband 7 times, and it says a paimar, her face to the ground. That's how you see. That's what Kida is. Kriya, what is Kriya? That's al bir kayim. That's just bending on your knees. The Chenu it says micharaya al birkov. Shishtachava, a full bow. Zu pishut yodayim v'raglayim. That's lying flat on your face and spreading out your hands and legs. Where do you see that? The Chenu a pasuk we're familiar with by the dreams of Yosef. Yaakov told Yosef, "Avoy novoy ani ve'imicha v'achecha l'shtachavoy l'cha arzo." To bow down to the ground. That's full pishut yodayim v'raglayim. Zok more about you. Boy Rava Shayla. We know that in order to be chayiv chorus or to be chayiv a carbon oil there's a minimum amount of time that you got to spend there. The shia, the period of time it takes to bow down, let's say it's 3-4 seconds, 5 seconds, how long it takes to read that pasuk. But what about for malchus? Tzarech shehiyah l'malchus or ain't tzarech shehiyah l'malchus? To get malchus, do you say he'd get malchus if he knew that he was tummy and he didn't go right away out? He waited a second. Would he get malchus for that? Chorus you only get if there's a shehiyah. How do we know? It's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But does this halacha l'Moshe Sinai also apply to malchus? So the shaila was tzarech shehiyah l'malchus or ain't tzarech shehiyah l'malchus. L'karban, l'gabe karban, our Mishnah already told us. Gemiri, we have halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you need a shir. Gemiri shehiyah. But l'malchus maybe like mir shehiyah. Maybe the halacha l'Moshe Sinai was not said in reference to malchus. So let's turn on to Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Or maybe Bifnim Gemiri Shehiyah. Any Avera involving inside the Beis HaMikdash, whether it's for malchus, whether it's for chorus, there's a din that it doesn't apply unless you waited there a certain amount of time. Loishna l'karban v'loishna l'malchus. Zakmar teku, it's a suffix, so we don't know whether or not someone would get malchus if he waited there just for a moment, but not the full amount of time that it takes to do a hashtachavoya. Baruch Hashem, we were zeichen to finish Daf Tesayin, and Be'ezhem tomorrow we're going to have Yud Zayin. Yud Zayin is 17, and 17 is the gematria of Toiv. So Be'ez Hashem, we're going to have a wonderful day tomorrow as well. A good tevach.
It will.
Tevach.